All right. So it's a few minutes after. It looks like they've chased most of the people out of the hallway, so I think I will go ahead and get started. Sustaining graduated projects over the long term can be a real challenge, right? But there are loads of resources that can help you make project improvements before you end up in a crisis. And I have links to these resources throughout the presentation, so the slides are already uploaded into Sketch where you can find them. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about me, but I have been in the technology industry for about 30 years, which is terrifying, working mostly on open source. I'm a board member of Open UK. I'm co-chair of the CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group. I'm also deeply involved in the CHAOS project, where I spend a lot of time thinking about how people can use metrics to understand how to measure and make improvements to open source projects, their health and their sustainability. I'll start with a really quick overview of the problem, along with some resources that you can use to help improve the sustainability of your projects across a few categories, including governance, contributor sustainability, organizational participation, responsiveness, and security. And then we'll wrap it up with a few final thoughts. So as I said, sustaining graduated projects over the long term can be a real challenge. I'm sure, are you guys hearing that feedback too, or is it just me? Okay. I don't know, maybe I'll step a little bit away from the microphones. So many maintainers and contributors are tired and they're burnt out. So they don't always have the time to focus on sustainability. Being proactive about making improvements before something escalates into a crisis can help make our graduated projects more sustainable and reliable for all of us. However, not everyone has the experience, skills, or time required to diagnose potential problems and use what they learn to make sustainability improvements. The good news is that you don't need to do this alone. There are loads of resources that can help you improve your project before you get into a crisis situation. With the CNCF Tag Contributor Strategy, we've spent years developing guides and templates that are designed for CNCF projects to use. So I'll focus on some of those resources that are most applicable to graduated projects. But we're not limited to just the CNCF resources. I also work within the CHAOS project, which historically has been focused on metrics. But more recently, we've been working on a series of practitioner guides that are designed to help improve open source projects across a few key areas. So I'll augment the resources from the CNCF and also talk about some of the CHAOS guides that can help make your graduated projects more sustainable over time. Now, governance was mentioned earlier. A lot of people think governance is just extra paperwork. It's busy work. It's the stuff that gets in the way of doing the real work on the project. But this isn't true of good governance, which really is about setting expectations and getting all of the various people within your community collaborating together. Ultimately, the focus of open source project governance is on the people, the roles we play, our responsibilities, how we make decisions, and what we should expect from each other as part of participating in the community. Having clear rules about how collaboration occurs, how decisions are made, and what types of contributions are in or out of scope helps community members make contributions that are likely to be accepted and embraced by the project. And this helps avoid wasting maintainers' time with contributions that aren't aligned with the project. A healthy project with clear governance makes people happy and helps set your project up for future growth and long-term success. Now, the tricky thing about governance is that it needs to be proactive. The time to work on governance is when things are going well. If you wait until there's a crisis of some sort within your community, you might not have the right processes for dealing with that crisis. And when a project is in crisis, that is the most difficult time to come to agreement on anything related to governance. So in general, we recommend starting with the simplest possible governance model and only moving to something more complicated when the project evolves to the point where that complexity is needed. because otherwise you create more overhead, you create extra work, when that time would be better spent on project development rather than governance processes. Now, since this talk is targeted at graduated projects, you should already have solid governance if you met the graduation criteria, but that doesn't mean that your governance model should stay exactly the same throughout the entire life of your project. Most CNCF projects start with what we call the maintainer council model, which of course we have a template for. And this is the simplest form of governance and the one that we recommend for most CNCF projects. This is where maintainers make the decisions in the projects, usually by consensus, but there's also usually a provision for voting for certain cases. And as projects become larger and more complex, you might or might not need to move to another governance model. We have a template for projects that are made up of different sub-projects, where maybe you need a multi-level structure where you have sub-project leadership that flows up to overall project leadership. But this is a pretty complex model, and we only recommend it in cases for projects with a lot of semi-autonomous sub-projects. We also have a template for elected steering committees, but again, this adds a lot of complexity and is really only recommended for projects where maybe there are multiple groups with competing priorities, maybe a very large number of maintainers where it becomes difficult to operate by consensus, or when there's a need to enforce employer representation limits for certain projects. And again, we recommend using the simplest possible model, even for graduated projects. And also this same advice holds for sandbox and incubating. And while we don't require a governance model for sandbox projects, it's recommended to have at least something lightweight, and some governance is required for incubating projects. And I'll talk more about this later. We have a TOC project reviews working group session at, I think, 150, where I'll talk about how we do governance reviews for CNCF projects. Now, when I talk to CNCF projects, the most common question is, how can I get more contributors for my project? Because this is such a common issue, we've created a bunch of resources on the topic of building community and growing your contributor base. And these resources are primarily targeted at maintainers. And you can see in this image that we have more resources than I can possibly cover in this presentation. So I encourage you to have a look on your own, maybe when you have some time for a little extra reading, in your copious amount of spare time that maintainers have. One of the other questions that I get often is about project health and how to determine areas within the project that maybe aren't particularly healthy and could use some improvements. And we know that metrics and dev stats can be a little bit overwhelming at times, and maintainers, again, don't necessarily have all of these extra hours to just dig through the metrics to find something useful. So we do have a guide devoted to that topic as well, and it's designed to walk you through how to look at metrics for a couple of very common areas that are probably important for most projects. And many of those topics are ones covered later in this presentation, so things like responsiveness and contributor activity. Many projects, including graduated projects, struggle to find enough people to actively participate in their projects and continue to maintain them over the long term. The reality is there are a lot of open source projects and not enough contributors. So maintainers are in desperate need for help across the various types of contributions that are needed to have successful, secure, and sustainable open source projects. It's important to think about how to better utilize your maintainers while also looking at barriers to contributions that might be preventing participation from potential new contributors. A good starting point is a contributor ladder. Defining the roles and responsibilities for contributors, reviewers, maintainers, and other roles can really help with recruiting new people into these roles. We think of this as a ladder because contributors climb up to become reviewers, those reviewers climb up to become maintainers, and what's important is to have some documentation so that people understand how they can climb the ladder and how they can gain more responsibilities within the project. A contributor ladder usually outlines different contributor roles within the project, along with the responsibilities and the privileges that come with those roles. Community members generally start at the very bottom of the ladder, the first levels, and then they advance up it as their involvement in the project grows. And this helps set expectations for the roles and encourages people to think about how they might take on increasing responsibility within the project. And as you get more people moving into maintainer roles, you can reduce the workload for the existing maintainers. The good news is that we, of course, have a template that you can use to avoid building this from scratch. Most graduated projects probably have a contributor ladder already, but it's worth revisiting occasionally to see if there are any other roles that you need or other ways to improve it to make it easier for people to move up within your project. But we also need to get more people on that first rung of the contributor ladder. And a great way to do this is by providing more resources and support to bring people into our projects from outside of our traditional pool of contributors. To help facilitate this, the LF is just launching this brand new mentorship program. And if you're interested in mentoring people from underrepresented groups, you'll find more info in the sign up by following the QR code. Our open source projects thrive when we welcome new contributors from a variety of different backgrounds. And through this mentoring program, you can support new contributors by helping them navigate making open source contributions, maybe co-presenting with them at conferences, offering career advice, and loads more. And these actions can make a big difference in someone's career journey. So I encourage you to think about how you can participate in this mentorship program. For those existing contributors, it can help to look at your contributor data in DevStats to look for people who maybe are starting to contribute more often or more regularly, and you can keep this in mind. You can also keep this in mind as you're reviewing PRs and maybe notice when someone's making solid contributions, which can help you think about who you can encourage to contribute more, and then maybe find someone who could move into a maintainership role or another leadership role. And reaching out to someone and acknowledging their work and while encouraging them to do more can help quite a bit with growing your contributor base. Sometimes people just need a little bit of encouragement, and you can ask them for specific things that you know that they're good at. And there are several communities that I've gotten more involved in because someone asked for my help with something. Now the catch here, and with many metrics and other data, is we do not just want to think about the people who are making commits. It's a good start, it's fine, but you should also be thinking about how you can move people into leadership positions to be responsible for things that might not show up in your existing data, like documentation, community management, marketing, and loads of other important roles. Because these activities take up valuable time from maintainers, and someone with actual expertise in these roles can probably do the work better and more efficiently to help the project become more sustainable. And you can add these to your contributor ladder and promote people into maintainer roles to have them be responsible for things like community management, documentation, program and product management, marketing, and loads more roles. And the Chaos Guide linked on the slide has a few more suggestions for improving contributor sustainability. Now for graduated projects, when was the last time you looked at your contributor guides and other onboarding documentation to make sure that new contributors can easily get started within your project? Good documentation is how we scale the things that take up precious time from our already overworked maintainers and free up their time to do other things. If this is well documented, new contributors can get started with a minimal amount of help from existing maintainers, which can save you a lot of time in the long run and reduce frustration from maintainers who get tired of answering the same onboarding questions over and over and over. Especially for graduated projects that are mature, it might have been a while since someone looked at your onboarding and contribution guides. So it can help to find someone who's brand new to the project and ask them for feedback on these docs. And you'll also likely need to overhaul your contribution guide occasionally as your project evolves and as processes change. We also like to think of ourselves as maintainers as irreplaceable, but we aren't. We move on to other jobs, we burn out, we retire, and sometimes we just decide we want to do something else with our time. And this is especially true for graduated projects where people may have been working on these projects for a pretty long time. And you should think about how you can prepare someone else to take over after you move on to something else. And we encourage CNCF projects to have an option for people to move into emeritus roles, which recognizes the hard work you've put into a project and gives others a point of contact if they have questions about what came before, while also allowing you to step away from the day-to-day responsibilities of the project. So I encourage you to think of stepping into an emeritus role as a successful way of handing your duties off to the next generation of maintainers. A roadmap in an open source project it's a strategic plan that outlines the project's vision, goals, and maybe major milestones over a specific period. People tend to think of roadmaps from the perspective of project and product management to prioritize features and the tasks you work on as you work toward that next release. But roadmaps also serve an important role in attracting and retaining contributors. Roadmaps build trust by offering transparency into development plans and your progress as a project. And by using something like GitHub project boards, for example, you can integrate your roadmap right with your existing issues and make it a lot easier to attract and retain contributors by highlighting ongoing and planned efforts. And this enables contributors to identify areas and maybe times when their skills fit into the project's planned work. Now, roadmaps also play a crucial role in capturing and communicating strategic planning for projects. They provide clear direction for adopters, contributors, and stakeholders, outlining the project's direction, timeline, and execution strategy, all of which are required for project success. And the guide linked at the bottom of the slide has a whole bunch of details about different types of roadmaps and how to build a roadmap for your project. Now, the CNCF needs to balance the interests of a very large community made up of a wide variety of stakeholders without favoring one over the other to ensure that we have a vibrant cloud-native ecosystem made up of sustainable, high-quality projects. So vendor neutrality is a requirement for CNCF projects. And this is especially important for graduated projects. The document linked on the slide provides guidelines on what it means for a project within the CNCF to be vendor neutral. In particular, to communicate, drive architecture decisions, and govern in a vendor neutral way. Now, I already talked about governance, which is an essential element of vendor neutrality, but it isn't the only one. We do understand that adopters often ask about commercial offerings within projects. So CNCF projects operate under a key principle that no one company should be favored over another. So this means that each vendor should have fair representation and objective information should be provided across the project and across communication channels like blogs, social media, other messaging platforms. It also means that community meetings, events, resources, and infrastructure should be hosted on resources belonging to the CNCF or other neutral third-party resources like GitHub, rather than being hosted by one of the participating companies. From an architectural and road mapping perspective, decisions on project direction should allow opportunities for all contributors and adopters to receive consensus on their features, their PRs, et cetera, and not promote one organization over another. And participation in the project should be transparent and in the open, where everyone can participate equally within the project. And the guide linked on the slide has loads more details about the requirements and how to meet them for your project. So think about this for a minute from the perspective of end users and how they might assess the risk of adopting your project when deciding which technologies to include in their stack. Adopters often look at organizational diversity as part of the health and risk assessment for open source projects that they plan to use. If all or most of the contributions are from people at a single company, what happens when that company has a shift in strategy or gets acquired, or runs out of money and just goes out of business? Would the project be able to continue if that company pulled all of its employees out of the project? Now, you might think that this doesn't matter for CNCF projects, but it really does come up occasionally. So I'm not going to pick on any one company, but there was a case a few years ago where a company who employed most of the contributors to a CNCF project decided to fork it and run it as a company-owned project under a different license, which left people scrambling to find contributors to drive and maintain the CNCF project. There was another case where the company that was paying most of the developers for a project went out of business. In that case, the company was actually super proactive in helping to find ways to make sure that the project continued after they shut down. But what if they hadn't done that, right? If most of the work is being done by people at a single organization, even CNCF projects might be perceived as riskier to adopt than a project with contributions that are spread out over many organizations with no single organization being dominant. So in both of the cases I talked about, we recovered as a community, but it still introduced disruption and uncertainty for the people using those projects. And this is one of the core reasons behind that vendor neutrality requirement for CNCF incubating and graduated projects. Now, this is particularly challenging because quite a few CNCF projects are contributed by companies, and it can be hard to recruit contributors from other organizations, especially when most of the existing contributors are from a single organization. One challenge that I think a lot of people overlook is that the behavior of your employees within a project sets expectations that you might not have considered. And those expectations are often set before the project even gets to the CNCF. Are all of the questions, issues, and PRs responded to by employees of your company? If so, you're setting the expectation that employees are the only ones who do the work. And you need to make space for other contributors and proactively encourage people to contribute. Another difficulty is that for most CNCF projects, contributors from other companies don't just magically appear. It takes actual, real work. I think sometimes projects hope that by being accepted into the CNCF, that it will result in just waves of contributors appearing out of nowhere to contribute to your project just because it's part of the CNCF. I do wish it worked that way. Sadly, it does not. The reality is that recruiting contributors is hard work. And to be successful, it usually requires some manual and proactive effort. So don't be afraid to use your corporate connections, if you have them, to recruit contributors from maybe some other organizations by reaching out to people or customers that you know are using the project and might be interested in contributing. In many cases, this might involve pulling people who work for other companies proactively into a discussion. So something like, hey, I know you've made a lot of use of feature whatever. Do you have a few minutes to respond to this issue or this pull request on that topic? And this shows the individual that you respect their expertise, and it shows the rest of the community that you want and are encouraging participation from other people outside of your company. And if you aren't sure about the organizational participation in your project, there is a companies table in DevStats that can shed some light on which organizations are contributing to a project. And the practitioner guide, also linked on the slide, has a few more tips for improving it. It's important for projects to respond to contributions in a timely manner, because a quick response can help you retain contributors who otherwise might become discouraged if they don't get a quick response. Timely, thoughtful, and kind responses to contributors indicate that you appreciate their work. Being responsive to the contributions of other people helps grow the community and improve contributor sustainability. While quick responses are important, it's also important to keep up with pull requests and resolve them in a timely manner, even if the response is closing requests that are just never going to be merged. Now, it is super easy to get behind on incoming contributions, and we all get behind on them occasionally or all the time. But not addressing these contributions promptly really just creates technical debt and reduces the chances that they'll ever be merged, because those older change requests are likely to have so many merge conflicts that they just become too difficult to accept. So it's better to have that hard discussion early and just get it closed rather than just letting it linger for ages. Now, it can be tempting to to attempt to solve issues with responsiveness by just putting more pressure on the existing maintainers, asking them to respond more quickly, resolve more contributions, but this almost never actually solves the long-term problem. It might result in short-term gains, but it could be damaging to the community and the project over time if you're burning out your maintainers by not resolving the underlying problems that are causing that lack of responsiveness in the first place. So if you see responsiveness declining, there are a few things that you might do. First, it can help to set expectations and help contributors understand when they might expect a response. It might also be time to move more contributors into leadership roles, as I talked about earlier, and promote some trusted contributors to become maintainers. And finally, you might want to create or improve your issue and PR templates to make it easier for people to make high-quality submissions that require less work from your existing maintainers. And the guide linked on the slide has a few other ideas for improving responsiveness. Now, I wanted to mention security, but I'm not going to go into too many details because, let's face it, there are other people within the CNCF who have way more expertise in this area, and graduated projects should have a pretty good handle on security, but I wanted to remind people about how important it is to be proactive about security, especially with all of the visibility that security's been getting over the past few years. So staying ahead of potential security issues can help build trust with your adopters and improve the sustainability of your CNCF projects. People tend not to trust projects if they have unpatched security vulnerabilities and other security issues. So they're more likely to adopt projects that they trust to be more secure. So the first link on the slide goes to some resources from Tag Security, where you can find templates, publications, and loads of other resources to improve the security of your CNCF projects. Building sustainable open source projects over the long term can be a real challenge. And this work never stops during the life of an open source project. Project leaders and contributors are busy people, and they don't always have the time to focus on growing a community and maintaining their software, along with all of their other many commitments. But the good news is we do have resources to help you continuously improve your projects. But this is something that you need to continue to think about, even for graduated projects that have been around for years. Being proactive about improving sustainability before it becomes a crisis can help make our software more sustainable and reliable for all of us. So with that, I will say thank you, and we can open it up for questions. Questions? It wasn't all that clear. I'm just going to stand here awkwardly until somebody asks me something. And people who know me know that I will stand here forever, awkwardly, and wait. Yes, you have a question.
Yes, so you mentioned dev stats a lot.
Yeah.
And I've also seen a couple times the LFX Insights, I think it is like the sort of the insight into projects and how sustainability and all that stuff you're talking about with dev stats. Do you feel like all that is there in the LFX Insights tool now, or is like...
That's an excellent question. I honestly don't know the answer to that because I've always been a little more focused on dev stats because historically that data's been a bit more reliable. I haven't looked at LFX Insights in a number of years, and I've heard that it's gotten a lot better and that they're taking a lot of feedback from people, and I know that that's the direction that the LF and the CNCF want to move towards. So I assume it's getting better, but I'm just not that familiar with Insights. Josh?
I feel that we have a problem
Yep.
along and working some of the other Insights. The goal is for that eventually to supplant. However, the LFX Insights team is starting with areas of metrics that DevStats didn't cover at all, right? Because that's the priority. And so for a lot of things that are very maintainer-oriented, DevStats will do things like median time to respond to PR, et cetera. They're not going to get around to adding that kind of stuff to Take Insights for a while. So my suggestion is that you use both because there will be some stuff in Insights that's not in DevStats, right? But DevStats still has a lot of stuff that's not in insight, and also understand, it's been a learning process. I worked on DevStats, and we discovered exactly how complex the GitHub data is. And so some numbers we don't match, and they don't match because we had to have certain compromises in DevStats that they're handled a different way in insights. And, you know, you ever like have numbers that don't match really confusing way, bring that up in one of the channels, we probably explain to you why they don't.
So to summarize, for anybody who couldn't hear Josh, because it's a big room, the CNCF is eventually moving to LFX Insights, but right now the two have different metrics. A lot of the maintainer metrics are still in DevStats, so we encourage you to use both. Long term, a lot of that will probably move to LFX Insights. Is there a question over here?
Giving tips for CPTs, any ceremonies that you would use to kind of focus attention towards computers?
Sorry, you're gonna have to speak up a little bit. I can't hear you. Is that microphone working? I'm looking at the guy in the back. That's all right. Just talk louder.
Any ceremonies, any tips, anything that you would use at CPTs to help putting the accent into lots of context? We're struggling to make sure it's for our maintainers, some maintainers want to maintain code.
Yeah.
They don't really care that much, so they understand the aspect of this community, but it's not necessarily how do you make that more appealing? How do you do that as a pure community?
Yeah, I mean it's a hard problem. I will mention that one of the resources on the contribute site is to how to make better use of your project meetings. So that might be one resource to start with. But you know, there are a few things that you can do in SIG meetings to help encourage some of the newer folks to get involved. And you know, one is being really explicit about things that new people can get involved in. Another is to have something like a shadow program. So you know, like the release team does. We've done it when I was participating in Kubernetes contributor experience. There was a shadow program for some of our various things that we did repeatedly over time. So a shadowing program can be helpful. And the shadowing program can actually, you can do that for lots of different mentorship activities. And it really is a good way to train up someone new in how to perform a task that the maintainers are already doing. And it's a little, being able to have someone shadow your work is, I think, a little more accessible to maintainers because they have to do the work anyways, right? They can pair with somebody on it and teach them how to do it, and then somebody else can start taking on some of those responsibilities. So I would say being more explicit about the things that are on offer to some of these new contributors that they can participate in, because I know when you attend a SIG meeting as like a brand new person, it can just be overwhelming. I've brought new people to these meetings and they're like, I didn't understand anything anyone was talking about. Like, I don't know how this helps me. So being really explicit about how new people can get involved. You can even do that towards the end of the meeting if that's easier. If some of the other people want to drop off but dedicate some time in the meetings to ways that new contributors can get involved if that's something you want to focus on. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Sandeep.
That contributor strategy is doing like a lot of wonderful work. So does it have something like a shadow program where someone could actually shadow an experienced person like you and learn all the different components, the tags, yes, and that?
Yeah, so the question was, do we within Tag Contributor Strategy have a shadow program ourselves? I would say we don't have a formal one. We've certainly done this with the governance reviews in the past. So we've had people pair up with some of us that have done a lot more governance reviews and kind of walk them through the process. So we've done it a bit more informally, I think. Yeah. But then the tag reboot is going to, I think, change a lot of things with Tag Contributor Strategy. So moving forward, things will be a little bit different, I think. Good. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah. That is one of the, I think that's one of the hardest things about contributor meetings. So I'm based here in Europe, so some of the meetings are until, 7 p.m. my time. They could be later, but I sort of refuse those. And it is really hard. And APAC is way worse. I mean, there's just not enough, there's no overlap, right? Within the Chaos Project, we do have an APAC meeting where, it's led by folks in Asia Pacific. It's done at a time, frankly, that isn't particularly accessible to anyone else, but works really well for APAC because it's kind of in the middle of their day. So that's one way to do it. And more async stuff over Slack, I think, is another way. I don't know, Josh, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would have add some detail to the more async stuff. So try to make sure that everything you do is clearly documented, which is actually also useful for
Mm-hmm.
So have really detailed minutes, for example. Make sure that, for example, meeting agenda items.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
How about if I use the mic? Yeah.
Oh, to repeat his question. Yeah, so the question was, with people distributed all over the globe, how do you make the meetings accessible to people in various time zones?
Yeah, well, loud. Okay. Dawn was saying do a lot more async, and I was adding some detail to doing a lot more async because I've been through this on several projects. So record your meetings, for one. If you can recruit somebody to be a note taker, then try to take detailed minutes, because that's the easiest way for somebody to catch up on a meeting. As much as possible, discuss agenda items on Slack or in a GitHub issue before the meeting so that people can have their input even before the meeting happens. Those are the things that I found that work most when alternate meeting times don't work, right? Because you can't get critical mass.
Yeah, and that having really detailed meeting notes is incredibly important, especially because you're dealing with people whose native language might not be English. Let's face it, even if your native language is not English, you can probably read through the parts of the meeting that you cared about in less than the hour that it would take you to watch the video. And it's also way easier to use translation services for those meeting minutes. So really lean into the meeting minutes. I'm getting over the time limit, so thank you all for your questions. This was lovely. Thank you.